Hi, I'm Nicole Davidson, and this is the Negotiation in Real Life podcast, the show where we take the lessons learned in real life negotiations to help you build your negotiation toolkit. We'll be hearing from lawyers, entrepreneurs, and senior business people about their best and worst negotiations. Negotiation is one of the most important skills for success in business and in life, but it's a skill we are rarely taught. For many of us, we develop our skills purely through trial and error. We see what works, discard what doesn't, and if we're lucky, we'll have a few good mentors along the way. In this podcast, we're going to give you access to an even greater range of negotiation mentors. Enjoy this episode and please reach out if you have any questions. Welcome to Negotiation in Real Life and our first episode for 2023. We've had a fantastic break, but we're back and we've got a great lineup of guests ready to come to you over the next couple of months, so I hope you enjoy them. In today's episode of Negotiation in Real Life, I speak with Brad Nicholl. Brad is a senior associate at Hicks Oakley Chessell Williams in Melbourne. At his firm, he's been afforded the opportunity to pursue his passion for both the front end and back end of commercial law, particularly in the franchising context. This means Brad is regularly called on to employ negotiation skills to advance his clients' interests, whether it be the negotiation of a business acquisition or the resolution of a dispute. In our discussion, we talk about mediating in a franchising context, the benefits of mediating early, the litigation strategy of bleeding the other party dry, and I can't say we recommended it, whether going to mediation should be seen as a positive thing or a negative thing, tips for due diligence before entering a franchise agreement, front-end and back-end negotiation styles, the importance of getting a signed agreement at the end of a mediation, and much, much more. I hope you like this episode. Please reach out if you've got any suggestions for guests or ideas of things you'd like us to cover. In the meantime, it's over to Brad. So, Brad, it's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Welcome to Negotiation in Real Life.
Oh, thank you, Nicole. Thanks for making the time to have a listen to my ramblings.
I am looking forward to your ramblings, indeed. Indeed. And I know we had a chat the other day prior to the podcast, and you were saying that, you know, your specialty as a lawyer is in franchising, but that encompasses quite a few things. So perhaps before we get into talking about negotiation, you might just like to give the listeners a bit of an overview of who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, look, I'm currently a senior associate at a firm called Hicks Oakley Chessell Williams. It's a private practice and endeavour, and the bulk of my day is spent, doing both the front end and the back end stuff within the general commercial area. A large part of that commercial area entails franchising, which then is, I would describe to be an umbrella term for negotiation, drafting and advising on contracts between franchisors and franchisees, advising on compliance, and a large part of it also involves quite a fair bit of dispute work when the relationship between the franchisor and the franchisee unfortunately devolves and there needs to be some type of outcome to resolve the problem. So I guess if I was to pick a favourite part of all of that, it would generally be the back end type of stuff, the argy-bargy of arguments and advocacy and so forth. But it is an area that does command a fair bit of, a large appreciation of the front end. So being able to work at a firm that offers both and being able to bang on the craft in both contexts, the front and the back end, has been really helpful to me.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's so true, isn't it, that, you know, if you're a back-end lawyer, understanding what's gone on at the beginning and how that all works is helpful. But I think also for front-end lawyers to really understand how the dispute process works and really opens their eyes about what they need to do at the early stages to try and ultimately avoid disputes rather than have to get to that stage anyway. So it's good to have a combination, I think.
Look, absolutely, and that's why I retain a foot in both camps. No one, I think, ever signs up to an agreement in the hope to go to court, at any stage during that agreement. The objective most of the time is for both parties to make money and flourish and advance their positions in life generally.
Interesting, because I often liken, whether it's a business ownership or whether it's a franchise, those agreements up front, I liken a lot to a marriage. It's that commitment to each other, as you say, to go ahead and make money. But just as in marriage, often couples won't look at doing a prenup and don't want to face the fact that disputes might arise. How do you find it in the sort of front end work that you do about the willingness of parties to put in or spend time thinking about the dispute resolution clauses that they might put into those front end agreements?
Look, I absolutely agree with you that, carrying on with your analogy as marriage, the honeymoon period is most of the time when I see franchisees say come in and ask for advice around a franchise agreement. And most of the time, that is their rose-coloured glasses, or the court-in phase has occurred, and the seeds have been planted from the franchise or sales representatives just about how great a certain system is. Now, trying to pump the brakes and having a franchisee, I suppose, come to appreciate that individual that they've been dealing with is liable to potentially leave that organisation, to not come good on some of the promises that they have made potentially on the way going into the franchise, and essentially trying to have a prospective franchisee look at it, as you said, just like a marriage, particularly given the length of term of franchise agreements. Generally speaking, about 5 years. 5 years plus, there are generally obligations like restraints and undertakings as to confidentiality that will impact on the franchisee's life moving forward. I suppose if I'm advising a franchisor, and I've had ample opportunity to do advisory work and dispute work for franchisors throughout my career as well, I'd like to say make compliance part of your strategy, which is essentially just be as transparent as possible and really promote as close as possible to equal information as you can, so that franchisees that come into the network do so with their eyes open. Now, in terms of the dispute resolution processes, there is a franchising code of conduct that applies to virtually all franchise agreements that come across my desk, and there is a mandatory dispute resolution process that can be followed, and if it's not followed, the party that's not following that process can be liable for a breach of good faith, which is if you're a franchisor facing that type of allegation, there's an objective penalty that attaches to a breach of good faith. But that whole process, it requires parties to if should they come to the dispute, set out the general nature of the dispute, the steps that the other party they consider should take to resolve that dispute, and ultimately their desired outcomes. So I know many of your guests, and I know that mediation generally is conducted in a post-litigation or post-filing context, but most of the time within franchising, it's actually before either party has determined to sue the other one in court and make it a public.
Which I really enjoy working on those, because I'm, as I think you're aware, I'm one of the franchising mediators on the panel for the Australian Small Business Family Enterprise Ombudsman, who manages that franchising code. And I see it as a real benefit that parties are coming to mediation before the litigation has proceeded. And anyone who's listened to the podcast before knows I'm a massive advocate for early intervention mediation. But interestingly, one of the things that I find is people will, when I talk to them, they're like, oh, we're really hoping to avoid mediation. Like mediation is this sort of punishment or something as opposed to a helpful tool. Where do you sit around bringing parties to mediation within the dispute resolution process?
I should clarify that whilst the code does prescribe a mediation process, and more recently an arbitration by agreement process, there's technically no prohibition on parties just suing each other off the bat. It's not customary to do so, but we've got to really look at the context, and the context most of the time is that you'll have a franchisee that is, they're alleging that they've lost a hell of a lot of money, say, because of their entry into the franchise. They're not going to be the ones to front up with $2 million worth to advance a case in the highest courts in the land. That said, of course, there is the ACCC that is, significantly well-resourced to do that if they choose to. But I would say that 90% of the time you've got a set of circumstances where there are genuine calls of action. You would think if you're acting for a franchisee against the franchisor, you've got hurt feelings, you've got a lot of animosity, and you've got this ongoing contract that basically requires them to continue to pay the franchisor franchise fees or marketing fees or both. And so where I see the place for mediation for franchisees in particular, it is an opportunity to prepare what your case would be and go to the mediation, leave nothing on the table. And the great benefit of doing that is that you are avoiding, obviously, the costs of litigation, which I think every mediator I've ever come across will even during an opening or, very early on say, look, have you considered the costs of the media of going beyond, your partner, the cost of litigation? And if I've done my job correctly, the franchisee will be incredibly well informed around just those costs. Really, the idea of a pre-litigation mediation is only as useful as how the other side views the process and how seriously they take it. And potentially, you could have a set of circumstances where a franchisor just views the pre-litigation mediation as a annoying step and sort of a chore that comes as a result of the franchising code of conduct that they have to go through. But they use the mediation as nothing more, as part of a war of attrition on a franchisee. In other words, make the franchisee spend all the money on lawyers and preparing a very detailed argument, or just really having invested a fair bit of money, and then just almost counting on a tendency of a party that can't afford to go to litigation just simply not to pursue the matter any further. Fortunately, that's not been my overall experience. Most of the time, franchisors are well advised to engage meaningfully in this mediation process under the code. There are benefits for them to do so. And indeed, when I'm acting for franchisors, it's never my position that we just go to a mediation and not participate at all and just, waste the day and drain the resources.
I think that sort of appetite of franchisors to get involved and resolve things amicably, or at least to resolve things in a structured way, has probably improved because of the risks of reputation and social media now. Because if you're a franchisor trying to sell franchises and there's complaints about the way that you've treated franchisees, it's going to make life much more difficult. So perhaps before the era of social media, they were more willing to do that sort of let's bleed them dry strategy that you've talked about, and it becomes a little harder for that to work these days, I think. So it's interesting that your experience is that that's not being done as much, perhaps.
If I'm acting for a franchisor, my ultimate takeaways to them are it really is an opportunity to avoid a massive business distraction. It's an opportunity to avoid something going public that you otherwise, cannot really afford to go public. It's an opportunity to get creative and really obtain some security, some control over what happens next, because there is a disclosure regime that franchisors need to abide by. Part of that is they have to disclose how many mediations they've, as a percentage, how many mediations franchisees have initiated or that they've initiated against franchisees in disclosure documents. Yep. When I'm advising on the front end, I have a look at that part of the disclosure document. I also look at former franchisees and whether they've given their contact details, and what are former franchisees going to say about you in the future if we don't resolve this matter now. Because some free advice that is out there on the ACCC's website is that there's a strong encouragement for prospective franchisees to request details of former franchisees so that they can get it straight from the horse's mouth around really what was it like to be a franchisee of X brand.
Yeah, I find it interesting that you say that part of the disclosure statement is how many mediations the franchisor has been involved in, because once again, to me, that's suggesting that it's a bad thing if the franchisor has been through mediations. And it really then would stop a franchisor from saying, look, things are getting a bit tough. Rather than letting this fester and get worse, let's bring in an independent person to help us nail this on the head and get this resolved. Once again, I think it's interesting within the profession more broadly that often mediation is seen as this thing that you want to avoid, rather than here's something that can help us actually get into the heart of a dispute faster and start resolving it. Just my little observation.
Yeah, that is an interesting take on that. I mean, I would say that there is 21 days for the parties to seek to resolve the dispute by themselves, and without the intervention of a mediator. So there is that, I suppose, the context in which a mediation or is actually conducted is that there's been 3 weeks of time where the parties are supposed to have tried to work together to see if there could be if they could reach an outcome. So I guess with that in mind, I personally think it is important to know just really what's the temperature of the network just before you buy into the franchise. Is it unhappy? Because most people don't go and engage lawyers just for the fun of it. They get a cost estimate. They see it's going to cost them money. If they're well advised, they'll be told about the business disruption expenses as well, the stomach lining expenses. And I will say to anyone, whether it's a franchisor or a franchisee or anyone that even outside the context, is there's no friendly way to do this. In the minds of many that receive a notice of dispute or any type of invitation to discuss matters where lawyers are involved, it's my true belief that most people interpret that as an attack. So I guess I do think there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of opportunity in the framing of a dispute, and really to try to get the other party to abandon maybe the reptilian instinct to just be on the defensive and freeze.
Oh, look, you have absolutely described there my key bugbear with the entire legal system, and I won't spend too much time going into this at the moment, but the legal system that we have is the adversarial system that really derived from criminal law, and it does put people into battle mode. And that's where, as you say, the number of times that I have seen people come to mediation where everything was going swimmingly, the negotiations were going fine, and then one of the parties got their lawyers involved and sent a lawyer's letter to the other side, and the other side then just stepped out of the negotiations completely because they were terrified. It had gone legal, and now suddenly there was this big threat over their head. And by the time we get to mediation, I can think of one example specifically. this was a landlord tenant. The landlord's going, I don't understand what happened. We were negotiating, things were getting fine. I went and got my lawyer just to make sure I was dotting all the I's and crossing the T's and hadn't missed anything. And next thing I don't hear anything from the tenant. And the tenant goes, God, we didn't think you wanted to negotiate anymore. That's why you got your lawyer involved. So that's the whole thing about our legal system. Perhaps what we could do is talk a little bit specifically about negotiations and particularly your experience of negotiations. Obviously, you've said you do front end, which is for the non-lawyers in the audience, that's sort of the contract design and deal making as opposed to the back end, which is the dispute. What's your experience of negotiating in these two different arenas? Do you change your style? Do you do things differently, whether it's front end or back end?
Yeah, so look, I had to be the one giving the lawyerly answer, but it really does depend, and it depends on how to use, I think, what is kind of an adversarial term in any event, but how the other side behaves when, say in the front end there's a proposed amendment or whatever the case is, how they behave is really going to be largely determinative of what you consider to be an appropriate negotiation tool. So to give an example, I think one of the surprises or the realities of working in the front end or the drafting, and that is that oftentimes you'll pick up the phone. That's generally my style, is to, say, in a business transaction, pick up the phone, make the introductions and go, right, okay, well, look forward to working with you, X, Y, and Z. It's meant to be a cooperative. It's meant to be a relatively less adversarial environment. But I have to tell you that sometimes you'll pick up the phone in the most objectively friendly of transactions, and it's like the person on the other side is just, you're in an appeal court, and there's just absolutely no love lost between you, and so that's been part of my experience, I think. And in terms of the adversarial side of things, well, that sort of is what it is. My approach is generally to approach reasonably, and to approach with some form of dispassion and some form of, I guess, I'd like to think, logic, because particularly in the front end, there are two people that are respective clients that have formed the view that they want something more or less that looks like what they've instructed us, and how quickly we get there is really now the part that we play in the process. It has been incredibly useful in both contexts, front and back, to basically check really what it is with the client. And it sounds very, very trite, but really making sure that your instructions marry up to what is on the black and white in the contract in front of you.
That's such an important thing. And it's interesting because one of the things that I do when I'm teaching negotiation is the difference between what I talk about as positions and options. And the position will be, the client's told you, this is what I want. The interest is, what does that give them? What's really important? And unless you understand why they want specific things, when the other side says, well, no, we can't give you that, it doesn't leave you much wiggle room. So actually getting the client to understand, well, if I want 30-day commercial terms, for example, why is it important? What is it that I'm trying to achieve through that? So that you've got some scope in the negotiations to go, okay, well, they can't give me 30 days, but what they can do is pay lump sums, or I don't know, they might have something different that they can do.
The clients are generally, I have found, from the commercial point of view, they are the ones that can often offer way more than what you can offer in the commercial context, and that's an open admission that your mind is on the legals, and you of course are commercial. That's it's vital that you're commercial in your approach to things, but I've seen clients get commercial to a level that I suppose your instructions don't really invite you to go down. But a book that I think everyone ought to read, if not already, and was recommended to me by a highly effective negotiator, is Get Into Yes. It seems like it's required reading for anyone who wants to further negotiation prowess. And I think not only when I'm actually in a negotiation, but when I'm taking instruction, there's a passage in that book that I defer to, and I a lot, and it's the most powerful interests are basic human needs such as security, economic well-being, and a sense of belonging and control over one's life. And the negotiation that follows from taking instruction on and advising on how to best get those interests across the line is so much fuller and so much more meaningful when you just have an appreciation of what is it really that people are trying to get to. Because for them, they don't understand generally that the lack of a vendor's guarantee, so you're acting for the purchaser. Well, the vendor's the company, they've said that they won't compete, but they until you actually explain, the directors without the guarantee say may be able to compete against you unless we actually document this thing. And that all traces back to what happens after this is done. So employing the negotiation tactics are fantastic, because it also kind of dredges up, really, sometimes it's the converse. It doesn't result in everybody clinking champagne at the end of the day. It actually results in the other side's lack of bona fides in cutting the deal coming to the surface, reticence to provide security for vendor finance, and so forth. And there's been, most things go through without a hitch, right? But there's been quite a few times where when things haven't gone through, you go, thank God, because there was never going to be a situation where those basic human needs were met without having gone through the negotiation process.
Absolutely, and I think that's such a key. I mean, you've talked about there so many things that I cover when I'm doing training, and love that you've come back to getting to yes. Some people will say getting to yes is a bit old hat now, but I think as a foundation and fundamentals, it is absolutely the place to start with negotiation. For listeners who don't want to read the whole book, there is a summary of getting to yes on my website. So head to my blog and have a look at that. And that human needs, there's also an article on my blog about that, 5 things you know before every negotiation. So have a look at that for some discussion around that. But I think you've absolutely nailed that, Brad. It's, super important to understand the psychological elements that are at play in every negotiation, not just the logical and rational, as you said. I mean, you've got to be logical and rational, but fundamentally every human decision is an emotional one. So I'm interested, I mean, obviously you've read Getting to Yes. Interestingly, I find, given that negotiation is one of the core skills of a practicing lawyer, it is a skill that's not particularly taught at law school. Aside from reading and experience, is there anything else that you've done to develop your skills?
Yeah, look, and this is not, I can tell the listeners this isn't something Nicole has put me up to doing, but it is listening to, and sure, you might say it's like reading, but I think it's completely different. It's listening to podcasts such as this one, hearing from others just what has worked for them, and looking at the recurring themes, and they're recurring themes because they're effective. And you've got a bunch of independent people saying the same thing, and you go, right, okay, well, there's a principle that I should adopt. I think negotiation, perhaps if it were taught in law school, and if it were taught in business school, and if it were taught as part of a professional legal training course, and I think it is, and in fact I know it is, but there really is no replacing experience, and hopefully there will never be anything that replaces experience, but the second best of that is learning from others to the best ability, to the best that you can.
I agree.
It's also maintaining the flexibility in your approach. Sorry, I spoke over you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, and you're right, it is taught at legal training, because I was teaching negotiation at the College of Law as part of their PLT course for about 5 years. And I have to say, it was repeatedly, out of the 5 days of practical training that people had on campus, it was the one day that everyone loved the most, because they could see the application, not just in their work, but it's also an everyday life skill. So I think that's really great. And as you said, experience is the most important teacher, but I think having a good theoretical understanding to underpin that before you go in is actually really important as well. It speeds up the experience process if you've got some of those ground rules to start with, I think. That being said, I'm interested in what have been some of the pivotal negotiations in your career, some of the negotiations or a negotiation that sticks in your mind as being a massive learning experience for you.
So this is more so in the adversarial context, prior to litigation. It's a franchise in dispute. I'm 1 year post admission. I'm acting for a franchisor, and I have prepared for this thing as prepared as I could be for this thing, I should say. I've trawled through. I've done chronologies. I've done as much verification as I could, and the mediations in a different state. Fly over there. I fly over with a senior person from the head office of the franchisor, and we have an amazing experience of going through the chronology, picking holes in the other side's story. The other side is prepared, basically. So we have this fantastic day of proving how wrong they are. Respectfully though, like we weren't, but at the same time, there were so many runs on the board, and it culminates, the thing about this mediation was it started at 9 a.m, and about 8 o'clock at night, we finally get to this situation that just, like, you could not have written a better outcome. Okay. But it's dot pointed, and it's, it's in general terms. Everyone's hungry. Everyone wants to leave, right? And we'll leave the document in for tomorrow or the next day, because we're all exhausted and we're all of one mind. Well, it's a familiar tale. You wake up the next day, you contact the other side. There's no response for a few hours. Turns into a day, and ultimately, what comes of it is nothing, because there's, you've just got these little dot points on paper. You've not actually concluded the deal, and it's horrific because you've reached a false summit on, you think you're going to be able to go back to, you jump on the plane, go back to head office, celebrate your win in inverted commas. But in reality, what has happened is you've gone the opposite direction. You've had people basically sign something in principle, right?
Yep.
That doesn't quite marry up to, it doesn't quite meet the test of an agreement. It's this document that they wake up the next day and go, there's no way in hell we can actually comply with these terms.
Yep.
We were exhausted by the end of the day, and the practical reality is that there's no resolution. And from that, I took that you can prepare, and that was great. That was incredibly helpful, and that's something I still do to this day, right? Being able to point out holes in a chronology is something that I will always say is so incredibly important. But what I took from that was, first of all, conclude the deal on the day if you can. You actually make it just such an essential thing that the deal is concluded on the day. And also, too, really sense check what it is the other side is committing to, because if the other side's committing to something that realistically was so fanciful and so, objectively, it seems to be too good to be true. Well, what you have to take into account is that at some point somebody actually has to comply with the terms of this agreement. Somebody actually has to make payment of the sum that they've agreed to late on that, on that night during, when they're hungry. And the reality is where is the outcome if people are just going to be able to wriggle out of it and not have any skin in the game invested in that outcome?
Well, this is really interesting because, I listen to this in the lens of being a mediator, and I question what that mediator was doing in letting that situation happen. Because yes, I get that, one of the benefits of mediation is you do have some time constraints. So there is that sort of sense of pressure to get to an outcome. But one of the things that I think every mediator should really be doing is reality checking the agreement that is being put in place. So there's two things that I think that mediator could have done differently without being disrespectful to the mediator, because I wasn't there in the room and I don't know what was going on. But firstly, I would want to go through and reality check as people are just agreeing to things. How's that going to work? And that could be as simple, one of the questions that one of the things that I'll often get with some of my rent relief mediation is people would say, oh, that's okay. I'll now, if we agree to this rent relief, I'll catch up the arrears in 24 hours. And the first question I will have for them is, what is the daily transaction limit on your bank account? Because if you owe 50 grand and you can only transfer 25 grand a day, you're not going to be able to comply. So I'm going and asking the questions to make sure that what's being agreed to actually can be done. Now, that was a really simple example I gave, but obviously in more significant ones, I'm going to make sure people have thought about, well, what does this mean for you? How does that impact on your business going forward if you agree to this? Because the mediator's job is not to get a settlement at any cost. It's to get a long-lasting, sticky settlement. The other thing that I think is this ability to actually, we get sort of constrained by the fact that a mediation is, a half day or a whole day, and we feel like we need to get to the outcome. That sounds to me like it was a perfect opportunity for the mediator to say, look, you're very close, but I think we need to actually adjourn this and come back so that we can go through and finalise that documentation to make sure everything's going to work in practice, which I'll be interested to hear your views on this, because, for me, when I have lawyers say, look, we're fine, we've got an agreement, just close the mediation, we'll go and document it, I sometimes get that sinking feeling in my stomach going, oh, is it going to all work out, or are they going to come up with little arguments that are going to make the whole thing fall apart? And I think when we spoke the other day, I talked about the fact the way I like to go through drafting is often to get a shared document on the screen so that people can quite quickly and effectively draft that document in collaboration, rather than, I'll send you a draft, you send me back your markups, and then we'll do more markups and eventually we'll get there. But, the ability to say, look, we've got this far, we've made this progress, we need to now come back to finalise, to make sure we get a binding document, is something I think doesn't happen as often as it could. So I'm interested what your thoughts would be around that, Brad.
Sharing the document on screen and getting the actual document that is not, getting the document to be a current proposition as opposed to some proposition in the future. Once everyone's had a chance to really sit back and figure out how to wriggle out of something that they've made the classic mistake of agreeing to something just so something will go away. It's like the sugar hit. I am a huge proponent of cutting to the chase as much as what you can. And I think that, it's funny to me with mediations, the drafting of the agreement is left often to the last few hours of the day. The parties are fatigued, the parties are hungry, the parties are, they just want it to be over with. And I've always thought, it's such an imposition on these tired parties to, at the last couple of hours, just go, right, let's now finally essentially reach the agreement, because the agreement is just interrupted air up until the point where you've actually got some terms on the table, so far as I'm concerned. So yes, I'm a huge proponent of sealing the deal on the day. That's it. And if the parties and their respective representatives have done their job leading into the mediation, there is no occasion to argue that, oh, well, we weren't ready, you caught us with you caught us by surprise, or there's some reason why, this agreement should not otherwise be enforceable. If the parties have gone in, they're well advised, there's been, exchange of documents, there's an agreed set of facts, maybe, that's the thing, but then the facts in dispute of this, there's no reason why you can't expedite what you're ultimately going to have to do in the litigation context. There's no reason why you can't take control of that process.
Yeah.
And get the benefits of that process. You might find, if you ask the other side to produce X, Y, and Z, or to justify what they've said here and there in an email, and they can't. Well, what's going to change between that and the date that that you actually file. Well, theoretically, nothing should change. They should be upfront. They should be honest. There's an element of trust that will be abrogated significantly if that position does change. So, it's in everyone's interest to, during the mediation, sure, be prepared, come to terms, but really bring those terms to the forefront as soon as you possibly can, because there's so much scope for the deal to go awry.
Yeah, totally. And I think, there will be times when new information comes up in the mediation that hasn't been shared for whatever reason. But I think that's the opportunity to defer the mediation and give the party that has just received this information time to go and reflect and think about it, rather than just continuing saying, oh no, we must get to an outcome today. Because they're the times I think that people will then go, oh, oops, I agreed to this, but I hadn't really fully examined the impact of this thing. So that's where I think, the ability to defer mediation and come back, this idea that mediation is just one time and then it's either settle or not settle, as opposed to it can be more of a process, is something that I think needs to change in how we view the mediation process itself. But, that's me getting on my soapbox again. I would love to know, before we finish up, what would be your key tip, if you had to give one tip around how to improve your negotiations, what would be the number one thing that you would tell people to make sure they do in each negotiation they're involved in?
So to improve your negotiation skills, it is so vital to just throw yourself into those podcasts I mentioned and other podcasts as well as books. But you actually have to live the experience and avail yourself to the opportunities to negotiate. Obviously scale how much you do this, but try different techniques. There are principles that can be applied to most cases, but at the end of the day, you're dealing with as you mentioned earlier, there's a psychology on the other end that you need to appreciate, and you also really need to be able to be flexible in the negotiation, and you need to be able to have a variety of options available to you in terms of negotiation techniques to avail yourself of. And you don't know what those options are until you actually learn from others and you throw yourself into the process. Within the franchising context, there are unique, as I've said, disclosure requirements for franchisors. There's an ongoing relationship. There are for franchisees, if there's no negotiated outcome that is reached, and there's a lot of real estate to be gained by really understanding just what it is the franchisor is going to have to say moving forward, what the franchisor is going to have to tell the existing network, and likewise, what the franchisee might say after termination, or what the staff of the franchisee might say about the franchisee after termination if it goes to the litigious context. So I think it's just throw yourself in, appreciate the landscape that you're operating in, because once you do that, your options are greatly increased, because you can actually build a way forward for the other side to go, right, what they're proposing gives me, it gives me economic well-being, it preserves my security, I can save face if I do this or that, and you can actually help them come to see it for themselves, as opposed to advising them. But put a well-placed question here or there doesn't hurt,
Yeah, fantastic. And I love that piece of advice. Just get in there and do it. And for people who want to practice their negotiation skills in a slightly safer way than doing it with real life clients or real life deals, stay tuned for the announcement of my Negotiation Masters program, which will be coming up, which will be an ongoing opportunity for people to come and practice negotiation, get feedback, and watch others as well. So think of it a bit like Toastmasters for negotiation, which will be coming later in 2023. But for now, Brad, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you about negotiation. Before we go, who are the sorts of people who should contact you for assistance, and how do they get in touch with you?
I've said a lot about franchising, and naturally franchisors and franchisees alike, whether it's reviewing your agreements or your compliance, or giving your advice giving you advice prior to your entry into a franchise agreement, or if it's in the context of a dispute or a potential dispute, you've got a very upset franchisee or an unforgiving franchisor, come and see us. Franchising is a strong point, but I open the invitation to any SME, to anyone who has a business problem or finds themselves on the receiving end of an attack, to come and see us at Hicks Oakley Chessell Williams. You can find my details on that website. On LinkedIn, you can just put in my name, Brad Nicholl, and we've got a commercial department, a commercial litigation department. We do insolvency work, but come and see us, and we can bring quite a fair bit of perspective to your problem and some options, and just give you an idea of what it is your options really are. I would advise, even if you're not in a dispute, come and see us. Get us to have a look at your practices if you're in the franchising context, and so that we can look at your compliance and see if there's any shortcomings or areas for improvement.
Fantastic advice. So much risk in the franchising space if you haven't complied. The costs of that are going to far outweigh the costs of getting a legal consultation, I'm guessing. So, Brad, thanks very much for coming on the podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Likewise.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. If you've taken away some great tips from this episode, I'd love to hear about it. So please connect with me via my website or LinkedIn. If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to learn more tips to improve your negotiations, head to our website, nicoledavidsonnegotiation.com.au, where you can follow my blog, view presentations and download resource sheets. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you get every episode as it comes out. If you have an interesting negotiation story that you'd like to share with my audience, head to the website and complete a guest application form. Until the next episode, happy negotiating.